For example, a hymn to Selene is prefaced with the words, burn an offering of Cretan storax on juniper wood, or take Ethiopian cumin and the fat of a virgin goat and offer it to Selene. Finally, Hippolytus of Rome, a Christian writing in the early part of the 3rd century CE, also suggests the independence of these Cletic hymns when he, in his diatribe against all heresies, attributes 2 hymns of this kind to the magicians of his day, who he claims were defrauding their clients with their magical performances. He describes a number of scenes in which a magos and his fellow trickster combine to conspire to deceive an audience. In one case, the trick involves the recitation of a short and apparently incomplete hexametrical hymn to Balbo. Approach, you of the netherworld of earth, of heaven, Balbo, at the wayside, at the crossroads, light-bearer, night wanderer, enemy of light, friend and companion of night, rejoicing in the howling of puppies and bright red blood, etc. And it ends with, may you come gracious to our immolations. As you can see, this hymn begins with the usual Cletic address, approach, you of the underworld, and follows with a list of epithets and names, similar to the Orphic hymn, the Hecate that I read at the beginning of the paper. This hymn to Balbo also ends with a reference to an ongoing ritual. May you come gracious to our immolations. The word used here in the Greek is duelai, which usually refers to burnt offerings of animals, but here it probably refers to the burnt sacrifice of incense that we saw earlier. This has to do with the context that Hippolytus describes. It's indoors in an underground room, an unlikely place to burn an animal. The second hymn, preserved by Hippolytus, is introduced as follows. After a magician makes the inside of the house dark, he claims that he will usher in gods and demons. And if, let's say, someone demands that he display Asclepius, the magician makes the following invocation. There follow 11 dactylic hexameters that take the by now familiar form of a Cletic hymn, which begins as follows. Zeus, thou immortal, though long perished child of Apollo, I call on you to approach my drink offerings as my ally. And then after 6 verses of praise, that praise the salvific power of Asclepius, which closes with the Cletic trope that we saw earlier of naming alternate possibilities regarding the gods' present whereabouts. Whether you're visiting the foundation of Holy Trica, or the beloved of Pergamon, or Ionian Epidaurus, come, O blessed one. The god invoked in this hymn is probably Zeus Asclepius, whose temple at Pergamon is mentioned 3 times by Helios Aristides in his orations, but nowhere else in Greek literature. Before and after the hymn, Hippolytus uses only the name of Asclepius, and the god is clearly a chthonic one, because Hippolytus goes on to say that after the hymn is recited, a fiery Asclepius appears to rise up from the floor. A successful bit of theatrical engineering, he says, by the magician's assistant hiding in the next room. So I should say, just so it's clear, Hippolytus thinks that all of this magic is a sham. It's all done with pulleys and mirrors and various things. Here, too, the goal of the hymn seems to be a theophany alone. In this case, the incense used in the other hymns is replaced by the libations mentioned in the second line. A change which makes sense, perhaps, because a chthonic god like Zeus Asclepius can be better attracted upwards by libations poured down into the surface of the earth, much as the scent of Sappho's incense rising up from the ground was designed to attract Aphrodite down from the heavens. The differences between the magical hymns preserved in Hippolytus and those from Egypt are significant. These hymns of Hippolytus do not include any Egyptian deities or nonsense names or strings of abracadabra of the kind that we saw on the lead tablet in the handbook recipes from Egypt. This is unexpected, of course, because Hippolytus' diatribe would have gained much more heft if the 2 hymns he quotes also contained a lot of outlandish words and syllables. These hymns of Hippolytus are, in fact, entirely Greek, both in content and form, and the one dedicated to Zeus Asclepius may even have been composed in Anatolia, because as far as we can tell, this god was only worshipped in Pergamon, as was mentioned earlier. In Pergamon, Anatolia, as was mentioned earlier, is the presumed place where the Orphic hymns were also composed and performed. If, therefore, Hippolytus was using as his source some kind of magical handbook, then this book was probably not the one produced in Egypt, like the book that presumably produced the hymns on the lead tablet, or the papyrus handbook discussed earlier. Well, my time is up, and it's time to conclude. We have seen that the genre of the Cletic hymn had a long life, attested as early as Sappho and Aeschylus, that these hymns, in addition to the general poetics of summoning, preserve a number of features that survive in the later Orphic and magical examples. For example, the request to the deity to be my ally, or the trope of naming the various other places where the deity might be when the call goes out. Most importantly, all of the early examples do not have specific requests, and two of the three make no argument about why the goddess should even listen. We also saw that in addition to sharing the same short length and Cletic form, the Orphic and magical hymns were also performed with a simple offering of incense, like Sappho's Fragment 2, and they served as flexible prefaces or introductions to a range of other ritual procedures or speech acts that were presumably performed after the deity arrived. These parallels support, moreover, the recently revived argument that the Orphic hymns were indeed composed for real ritual contexts. Thus, rather than see them as defective hymns that are missing crucial sections of an ideal hymn, we can now see, I think, that at least a third of the Orphic hymns belong to a specialized subgenre, Cletic hymns that aim at theophany. Finally, a few words about comparing hymns that were written nearly a millennium apart, especially when the early texts are taken from lyric or dramatic poetry, and the later from real ritual contexts. The main argument for such an approach is, of course, that traditional ritual speech is by definition conservative in nature and resistant to change, and that Greek poets presumably knew and drew upon this tradition as it suited their theme or their narrative. This is not a new idea. Since almost all studies of Greek religion use Homer, Aeschylus, and the other poets as their sources for the earliest rituals, and do so according to the same principle. In the case of the first hymn of Sappho, however, there is even more compelling evidence of such continuity because, as we saw, there are a number of hymns to Aphrodite in the later magical handbooks that aim at erotic compulsion and deploy burning incense as their sole offering. Over the years, scholars such as Archibald Cameron, Anne Pippin Burnett, Charlie Siegel, and John Petropoulos have shown that the midsection of Sappho's poem reflects the content and goals of these later erotic incantations in the magical papyri. But a series of discoveries, recent discoveries since their publications, shows an even closer connection to that moment when Sappho asked the goddess to bring to perfection however many things my heart longs to perfect. We saw how the same request appears at the end of the hexametrical hymn to Aphrodite, discussed earlier, and in fact we know that in the final strophe of her own hymn to Aphrodite, we saw how the same request appears at the end of the hexametrical hymn to Aphrodite discussed earlier. And in fact we now know that the final strophe of her own hymn to Aphrodite, Sappho is reflecting a long and continuous tradition of ending erotic curses in this manner. As we can see at the end of a parody of an erotic curse from a hexametrical fragment of Aristophanes' lost play, Amphiaraus. There are, moreover, as you can see in number 16 on the handout, and this is only on the handout, I couldn't fit it on the slide. There are nearly a dozen extant magical spells dating from the late Hellenistic period, the 4th century CE, which end with versions of the same hexametrical coda, goddess, bring to perfection this excellent incantation. So when Sappho asked Aphrodite to bring her erotic desires to fulfillment, she too seems to reflect a long tradition in which a Cletic hymn to the same goddess could be part of an elaborate erotic spell to force a woman to be erotically aroused and come to the performer of the hymn. Thank you.
crying out for help, both specific and also
In pain and anguish.
and also general, just be my ally. If there's anything else I want, please also support that. And as we all know who have ever donated to any cause before, once you've donated, you're on the suckers list. If you've ever helped me before,
That's
please
right.
help me again. So really wonderful. We have time for a few questions before we retire for the reception. So open it up for questions. Maybe I could ask just a very general question. I was really struck that there's not really any differentiation based on the level of the god, right? Like you speak to Zeus the same way you speak to Malbo or, you know, some of these lesser-known deities.
Well, it's a peculiar thing about Greek religion. My teacher at Stanford, Mike Jamieson, once pointed out that they use the aorist imperative for gods. The Greeks use that for gods and for slaves. I mean, it's very simple. It's except in cases of supplication, where you're in deep trouble at the beginning of the Oedipus, where you're begging for help. And but aside from that, they did not abase themselves, and they just used a simple imperative. Yeah.
So they're imagining the god as another individual.
Yeah.
Boris?
Thank you so much. What is the conservatism of the genre of language? What does this tell us about the daily lives of the people making these incantations, and where do they get the knowledge from?
It's a good question. I think a big factor, and something I'm very interested in, is how ritual speech is preserved in poetry. All right, so I have another paper that I'll publish soon, which basically says poetry is for gods, prose is for humans, right? And I'm able to show that incantations start out being entirely hexametrical, and then for various reasons, it has a lot to do with the names. People's names don't fit into meter, and then when you start doing the victim and the victim's mother and all these other names, that the actual curse is in prose. But there seems to be a desire to keep parts of it in poetry. So we have. So at the end of your handout, most of those incantations that end with bring this incantation to perfection, they're entirely prose except for that one hexameter. So I think the initial thing is that poetry helps people to remember these things. And then we have evidence for handbooks. I think there's, so beginning in the Roman Empire, we have lots of evidence for the use of handbooks, and a way of preserving these technologies and these texts.
Yeah, I thought it was really fascinating, and just maybe to talk a little bit more about the distinction between the more literary versions and the less literary versions. In particular, the literary ones seem to have on the penultimate line, the come here, and then an ultimate line, which is some sort of quality of the divinity summoned. Whereas some of the other ones have, as the ultimate thing, just bring to an end the end, right? Which is an interesting closure, close, 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 tell us, tell us, tell us.
Right.
And then there's also the curse tablet, which has the come, and then it has a long thing about why you have to come. Like what I did that means you have to come, and so the constraint. And it seems to me those are sort of three variations on, I'm not saying that, I agree that there's a genre, but there's like three variations of the format.
So what was the question?
I mean, just why do you think, why do the poets have kind of one little template, that is where there's the come and then one more line?
Right.
And then the magicians have a come and then the why you have to come. And then these sort of handbook versions, which is the end is end, end, end.
Yeah. So the end is also I have argued that it's in Sappho too. I mean, when she says, bring to perfection what my heart wishes you to perfect. So Sappho is putting this in a different verse form and making it more poetic. So I think the way I treat the the literary hymns is that they reflect, but they don't quote the tradition, right? They reflect, and in order for Sappho's audience to enjoy it, they have to know about these things, right? So that's what I would say. The differences between, wasn't entirely clear. There are two parts to the curse tablets, right? There's the Cletic hymn, which does not give an argument, right? And then there's the prose hymn, which gives explicit directions to the deity. And that prose part, we find there must be at least 30 curses, erotic curses of this type, both on papyrus and on lead from Egypt, which are just have prose curses like that, without the introductory hymn. So my argument is that this one long and sole example from Egypt that has both the hymn and the curse together is preserved the longer ritual.
Yeah, I mean, just maybe I'm sure my question was clear enough, but on the supplemental logic on both of those examples, there's the come line, and then the line after that in the first one is kate, since,
Yeah.
right? And then in the next one it's prin, right? And why you have to do it.
Right.
And both these are like why you have to come, which is Sappho is just says come and come with a qualitas.
Yes.
And then these are a why.
Mhm. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
But it's interesting this idea of naming the god, giving them a title as protector or ally or things like that. And, that seems to be part of the poetic tradition as well.
We can take one more quick question, or we can save our questions for the reception. Go
I
ahead.
have a quick question about the entitling convention for the Orphic hymns. The title is the type of incense to burn while reciting the hymn. And I'm just wondering why that is so foregrounded in those particular hymns. It seems almost like the speech act, I mean, one could argue, is subservient to the physical ritual that involves myrrh or these various materials. So I'm just wondering what the relationship between the material objects are that are associated with these rituals and the verbal incantations. Do you see a change in the priority of one over the other across time?
Well, I think there's two ways. It's a very good question. I think there's two ways to think about it. One way is to think that it's just a framing device, right? That the hymn is the most important part, and you give a title to it, and then you. Remember, this is the same manuscript that the Homeric hymns are in. They will have titles, right? So, but I also have been thinking about it as a kind of condensed version of a recipe, right? Because in several of the hymns that appear in the magical handbooks, you have a sentence like I read you three of them, right? Burn this incense on this wood, at this time of day, and then the hymn comes. So in that sense, the question is whether it's an anthology of hymns, right, with the incense thrown in, or whether it was actually a practical handbook. And I think it could be both. I think that originally it was a practical handbook, and that what we have is a condensed version. But this is one of the several reasons why Fritz Graf and other people think that it was these were really used. Right? You not only did you have to say the right words, but you had to burn the right incense. And I should also say that those hymns were seen to be used for initiation rites, perhaps for probably for single individuals or for small groups of people. So that strange word in the first hymn to Hecate, at the end of it, cowherd, bukolos, is a word from Dionysiac cult in Anatolia. That was the name of certain kinds of initiates.
Interesting. Well, Thank you so much, Chris. We have a libation of our own to get to, and so please do join me in thanking you.